good morning and welcome to our worship for Sunday 30th of October. Today I'm going to be considering how Jesus was and is the brightest light of all. I'm reading from Luke chapter 9 and starting at verse 28. About 8 days after Jesus said this, he took Peter, John and James with him and went up onto a mountain to pray. As he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. 2 men, Moses and Elijah, appeared in glorious splendor, talking with Jesus. They spoke about his departure, which he was about to bring to fulfillment at Jerusalem. Peter and his companions were very sleepy, but when they became fully awake, they saw his glory and the 2 men standing with him. As the men were leaving Jesus, Peter said to them, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what he was saying. While he was speaking, a cloud appeared and enveloped them, and they were afraid as they entered the cloud. A voice came from the cloud saying, "This is my son, whom I have chosen. Listen to him." When the voice had spoken, they found that Jesus was alone. The disciples kept this to themselves and told no one at that time what they had seen. The next day, when they came down from the mountain, a large crowd met him. A man in the crowd called out, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son, for he is my only child. A spirit seizes him. He suddenly screams. It throws him into convulsions so that he foams at the mouth. It scarcely ever leaves him and is destroying him. I begged your disciples to drive it out, but they could not." "O unbelieving and perverse generation," Jesus replied, "how long shall I stay with you and put up with you? Bring your son here." Even while the boy was coming, the demon threw him to the ground in a convulsion. But Jesus rebuked the evil spirit, healed the boy, and gave him back to his father. And they were all amazed at the greatness of God. Amen.
Lord, the light of your love is shining in the midst of the darkness shining. Jesus, light of the world, shine upon us. Set us free by the truth you now bring us. Shine on me. Shine on me. Shine, Jesus, shine. Fill this land with the Father's glory. Blaze, Spirit, blaze. Set our hearts on fire.
Imagine having the opportunity for the most amazing mountaintop experience possible and sleeping through it. That's what happened about a week after Peter had declared that Jesus was the Messiah, and after Jesus had begun to speak of his death to his disciples. Jesus took Peter, James, and John up a high mountain to pray. And as he was praying, Luke tells us that the appearance of his face changed and his clothes became as bright as a flash of lightning. And two men, Moses and Elijah, appeared in glorious splendor talking with Jesus. We're not told what time of the day was when this happened, but we are told that Peter, James, and John were very sleepy. They just climbed a long way up the side of the mountain. They were worn out, and true to form, they stopped, and that was it. Sleep seems to have overcome them as Jesus spoke with Moses and Elijah. But they did wake up, disturbed by the bright light surrounding them that they could only describe as being like lightning. And they caught a glimpse of heaven and the glory of God as they witnessed Jesus deep in conversation with Moses and Elijah. These two Old Testament characters were also glowing with light, but nothing like as bright as Jesus was. I'm not sure we can even begin to imagine what the spectacle must have been like. Such a bright light must have been almost literally seared onto those eyes for some time. We all know not to look directly at the sun, but here were the disciples doing just that, looking at the sun, spelled S-O-N, in all his glory, and clearly recognizing two people whom they'd never met, both of whom had been up mountains and met God in all his majesty during their own lives. Moses went up at Mount Sinai to talk with God and received the 10 Commandments. And we're told he came down with a shining face because he had met with God, that he needed to keep veiled. And Elijah jeweled with the prophets of Baal on top of a mountain, where he demonstrated the might and power of God. And he met with God again on a mountain, hearing him speak in a still, small voice. Now Moses was on the mountain with Jesus, representing the exodus from Egypt and the giving of the law to God's chosen people. And Elijah represented the prophets. That both the law and the prophets were very important in God's plan for his people, and that Jesus both summed them up and fulfilled them in his life and death was made clear by Jesus on more than one occasion. For example, he said in Matthew 5:17, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." And later in Matthew 22, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment. And the second is like it. Love your neighbour as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commandments." Jesus was the culmination of all that got gone before. It was in and through Jesus that God was to act, to bring his people back into a full and loving relationship with him. As Moses had led his people out of slavery in Egypt, so the death and resurrection of Jesus brings us out of our slavery to the consequences of sin, and the forgiveness offered us through faith in him leads us to freedom and fullness of life. As Peter, James, and John saw Moses and Elijah appearing with Jesus, they came to understand that this dazzling light was no ordinary light. It was the glory of God, and Jesus was the brightest light of them all. As the writer of the letter to the Hebrews later wrote, "The sun is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word." Having woken up to these 3 figures bathed in the glory of God, Peter, James, and John heard them talking to each other. How much of their conversation had they missed while they were asleep? We'll never know. It had been an unsurpassed opportunity to hear and understand more of God's plan for mankind, and yet they slept through so much of it as they were later to sleep in Gethsemane instead of supporting Jesus in prayer. They missed hearing Moses, Elijah, and Jesus talking about how his forthcoming death and resurrection would fulfill Old Testament teaching. And it would not be until Cleopas and his companion met with Jesus on the road to Emmaus that such a conversation would happen again. As beginning with Moses and all the prophets, Jesus explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. Luke 24, verse 27. However, once they were fully awake, we're told they did see his glory and the two men standing with him. Now, the disciples had never experienced anything in their lives like this before. It would be equally as alien to us in our own experiences. And they clearly had no idea about how to react to the situation, with Peter, who wanted to do something to mark the occasion, saying, "Master, it's good for us to be here. Let's put up 3 shelters, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He did not know what he was saying. What would you or I have said in that same circumstance? Would we have made the same mistake? Would we have just come out with the first thing that popped into our heads due to not understanding what was happening? I think that if we're honest with ourselves in their shoes, we would have reacted in a very similar way. When we're in what we term a mountaintop experience, we want to stay there. We want to somehow capture that moment and remain in it. We recognize, as Peter did, that it is good to be there, and we're reluctant to leave and go back to our normal everyday life, where we know that things will be different again. Peter sought to put Jesus on the same level as Moses and Elijah by building all 3 a place of adoration. But crucially, Moses and Elijah disappeared, and only Jesus, the brightest light, was left. And they heard the voice of God in a manner very similar to what happened at Jesus' baptism. While Peter was speaking, a cloud appeared and covered them. They were afraid as they entered the cloud. And a voice came from the cloud saying, "This is my son whom I've chosen. Listen to him." The personal authority and incomparable nature of Jesus were clearly confirmed by God in this moment. He was the one to be listened to and learnt from. His word was to be obeyed above all others. This was the message they needed to take away with them, the reassurance that Jesus really was the one to follow and put their trust in. Yes, I'm sure they'd love to have been able to stay longer to be able to take it all in, but it was time to go back down the mountain and to take what they had seen and heard into their normal, everyday life and experiences to help and sustain them in the mundane and difficult days. And so it should be in our worship and witness. What we learn in our mountaintop experiences is there to help us in our day-to-day living, remembering that in a sense we have the advantage over the disciples. They did not know or understand what the future days held for them, and in particular for Jesus, in spite of all that he said to them to prepare them for his death and resurrection. However, we live some 2,000 years after those events, and we do know what was to happen. We do know that the glory the disciples glimpsed on the mountain was the glory of God's chosen Son, and that glory would finally be unveiled on a very different hill, an ugly little hill, if you like, outside Jerusalem, where Jesus was crucified for our salvation, to be raised again on that 3rd day. The mountaintop experience also helped Jesus to prepare himself for what lay ahead of him, as he prepared to lead people out of the slavery of sin and death into the promised land of the new creation, the kingdom of God, when the whole world would be redeemed. The future days for Jesus were to contain opposition and difficulties. He would experience more and more conflict with the Jewish authorities, leading in the end to great suffering and torment, with even his disciples betraying, denying, and deserting him at the end. With nobody else to share in this with him due to their lack of understanding of the scriptures and his teaching, it would be a lonely time. Jesus got a little taste of that when he descended to the mountain with Peter, James, and John to the chaos of the failed attempt by the other disciples to heal a boy. And you get a sense of the frustration of Jesus as he calls the people an unbelieving and perverse generation. But once Jesus healed him, we are told that all the people there were amazed at the greatness of God. Peter, James, and John had been amazed at the greatness of God on the mountain. The people were amazed when they witnessed the miracles of Jesus, but still they didn't understand. We may be amazed at what we know of Jesus, yet in spite of this, often don't understand what God is doing and saying. We can be like the disciples, saying and trying to do the wrong thing in response to what we see of God, but we can do something about that. We are reminded, as were Peter, James, and John, to listen to Jesus, God's own Son, and to follow his leading. We may not have the opportunity to physically climb an actual mountain this week, but as we read our Bibles, as we talk to God in prayer and in worship, may we hear his voice and seek to understand what he is saying to us, listening carefully as he speaks to us as individuals and as a church. And having heard his voice, I pray that each one of us will be able to find our strength and encouragement in him each day of our lives. May we see the glory of Jesus, the brightest light of them all.